My name is Liz Todd. I'm Professor of Education and Inclusion at Newcastle University.
Hi, I'm Sara Bryson. I'm a community organiser with Tyne and Wear Citizens, which is a chapter of Citizens UK.
Sara and I together have written a chapter for this book, which is Hope Under Neoliberal Austerity. I'm also one of the editors of the book. And the purpose of the book was to look at responses from civil society and civic universities to whether different kinds of social innovations are transformative, or are they just sticking plaster to what's happening under neoliberal austerity, what's happening under COVID, Brexit, and all the different challenges, the massive challenges that we have in society. So we wrote a chapter on Citizens UK and Tyne and Wear Citizens, and what has happened in terms of Tyne and Wear Citizens and the university working together on a number of things in the North East.
I think the best way to describe it is as a methodology. So it's not the only way to change the world, but it is a way. And as someone who's tried to tackle issues like neoliberal austerity, poverty, inequality for decades now, I think in the past I've always approached it with just a lot of hope and haven't had a thought out plan of how you go about doing it. So for me, community organising is the methodology that citizens use to move from that crisis response, that stick and plaster, to try and bring about transformative change in communities.
And it's an organisation that's got a history. It goes back to the civil rights movement in the States. It's had a long history in the UK, and then it's come recently to the different cities outside London.
The key thing about that is that within educations of civic society, so whether you're in education, community or a faith group, on our own we don't have a lot of power to bring about the kind of changes that the book discusses. And what's very deliberative within community organising is that if you want change, you have to have power, and you have to deliberately build that power if you want to bring about the changes that you're seeking. And the only kind of power we have really is people power and is relational power. You know, we often don't have the other kind of like power over types of power. It's power with people. And so we can't do it on our own. We have to work in an alliance with other institutions who are very different at our own. But collectively we have the power, which means that we can then have that transformative change. But it means you have to agree to disagree on lots of things and focus your time and your energy into the things that we agree on that we think needs changing in our community.
Yeah, absolutely. But the problem that we're trying to be the kind of answer to in terms of what our chapter is about the fact that people, citizens, are rarely involved in transformative changes, are they? Really? I mean, if they're lucky, they get services, or if they're lucky, they can get on to try and protest or do things or try and solve things in their communities, different small kind of problems. But actually, people being involved in transformative solutions is what Citizens is kind of the answer to.
Absolutely, and I think like a lot of things are a done to type of approach. So as somebody who grew up in poverty, like a lot of the solutions around economic inequality and poverty are very much done to people. If you look at like the food bank responses, they're crucial responses. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being critical of crisis responses. They're crucial and needed. If someone's hungry, they need to be fed. But we don't want to be in a situation where Newcastle at the moment has the biggest used food bank in the country. We don't want that food bank to be there. We don't want the need for the food bank to be there. So how do we move beyond that to actually tackle the issue? You've got to work with people who use food banks. Why is it a need? What are the underlying issues, and how do we start to address that together? And I think that's what's magical about community organising is it starts with listening, it starts with people's lived experiences, and then they are the people that have to lead that change themselves, which is a big challenge for a place like a university that is expert in so many things and has a lot more power than somebody using a food bank. Like, how do you bring all of that together? And I think we have managed to do that.
This is the university engaging its own citizens, as in the people in the university, and there's millions, there's thousands of people in the university in terms of students and staff.
And it's often not how a university works, right?
Yeah,
That's not been the shift of universities.
It's quite interesting. It's really, really interesting. But it's also a shift in where quite a lot of universities were going. So a lot of universities in the UK and actually in the world have been moving towards a kind of more commercialised and more individualised and more competitive. And that's actually Newcastle University has moved away from that, more towards back towards the civic university of the past, because that's actually where universities came as a need in society. And a lot of universities aren't engaging with their place, and that's again what we are doing. We've been doing this over the last decade, re-engaging with our place and wanting to be responsive to where we are.
Absolutely, and what I really value is that the university is an equal partner in that alliance.
Yes.
So some of our other member institutions are schools or unions or churches or the mosque.
Yeah, different sizes out there, some really small organisations.
Exactly, some tiny little organisations, and then the university is huge, but it's an equal player. When we have our formal meetings, everyone gets one vote.
Exactly, that's what I find fascinating. We're here with thousands of people, but we get the one vote, and that's. But we do also have to make sure that a certain number of people turn up, and it's really good.
Yeah, and people are able to sit back and allow people with lived experience to lead the issues, but are able to know and understand where the research can contribute and help campaigns that we've led. All of the campaigns that we've led have had academic input. So when we first launched, we had 3 campaign areas. One of them was Islamophobia and hate crime. And what we had was Muslim women describing their experience and saying that there'd been a massive rise in racism and hostility since the Brexit vote. But because people tend not to report hate crime, it didn't show up in the figures. So there was a lot of disbelief around that of, really, is that really rising? And people just not believing what they were saying. But we had an academic at Newcastle University, Peter Hopkins, whose own research backed that up.
Right.
And he was able to bring that to the table,
Yeah.
not take over from the women that were leading the campaign, but say, actually, I've got evidence that supports what they're saying. We had a mental health commission to look at the increase in mental ill health across the region. That was led again by people with lived experience. We had public hearings, we had hundreds of people give testimony. But the university worked with us to produce a final report on the whole thing. We also had a lot of work in and around poverty. So Just Change, which was a campaign led by young people around free school meals, which you worked with us on and your research supported.
Yeah, absolutely.
And living wage and poverty and inequality. And obviously the university hosts the North East Child Poverty Commission.
Yes.
And we work really closely. So it was, where does working together give us more power and more clout to bring about transformative change, rather than, the university knows more than everyone else because we're, this is our job and our profession.
Yes.
It was bringing together people's lived experience and supporting that with academic rigorous research, which meant that we had quite a powerful campaign to push forward for change. It's about the solution, because the thing about community organising is we don't just describe the problem or talk about it, we always bring to power the solution and a very direct ask: will you or will you not have a hate crime charter on public transport?
This is the methodology.
Will you or will you not pay the real living wage? And that, we find that leads to more transformative change than a stick and plaster, because you're asking very specific things. But those solutions have to come from the people with lived experience, because if it doesn't affect their lives, it's not worth campaigning on.
Yes. I mean, and all of these things were really demonstrated in our Real Living Wage Listening campaign, weren't they? So the Newcastle University was not a real living wage employer in 2018. And then it became clear that actually there's more people in the university that wanted to move that whole thing forward, and the time seemed to be right. And the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Julie Saunders, formed a Real Living Wage task and finish group, and a kind of group in the university to do that, bringing different people together. And as part of that, wanted a listening campaign. So what we did was, and I led this training 45 staff and students of all levels of staff, all levels of students, and it was just magic. So getting that number of people trained in terms of how you do a listening. We had to do a pilot first, so I just got friends and people who got involved in Citizens from the university, a few students, a few staff, to just go out around the campus listening to people and talking to people, because can you just ask about people's pay? Is that something you can ask? Is that, where do they want to be asked? Anyway, we did that pilot, and then we trained 45 people, and then we, with a lot of help from different people in the professional services, we got about, 30, 35 more, whatever, focus groups going on around the place that these listeners, these people trained, listened to in pairs. We listened to more than 200 people who at the current time were not being paid real living wage. They were cleaners, they were in catering, hospitality, they were
Porters.
porters, around estates. They did all kinds of work around the university. And what we realised was, we asked them two simple questions. One was, do you think the university should be a real living wage employer, and what's it like working here? And the people doing the listening, they sent us the notes, so we got 90 something pages of notes back to look at, and synthesise that down to a report. But those voices went to the executive board, and that was quite powerful. And I think, and that plus the modelling that the university did, that Julie Saunders did with her team and other people, the modelling about staffing, the modelling about kind of grading and all those kind of things, plus the academic input. So somebody came up with a thing from the Smith Institute report in 2018 that found that if 25% more businesses paid the real living wage in the north of Tyne Authority, they'd bring in something like £29 million to the region.
Yeah.
And at that time, we only had 30 living wage employers.
The lowest percentage of living wage employers in the whole country in the northeast. Yeah. But we also have the biggest used food bank and the highest number of people on 0-hour contracts.
And now, how many do we have?
Now we've got almost 160.
160?
Yeah.
Goodness me.
So we can tangibly say that the campaign, if you want to think about transformative versus stick and plaster, we've given thousands of people in the region a pay rise. But I think it wasn't a passive process.
Okay.
It wasn't just that people went and listened to people and then wrote a report. The people who were sharing their stories were actively involved.
Absolutely.
So there was a Fair Work campaign.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just tell us your stories and then we'll take it away and we'll do good
That's things.
A really good
it was
point. Share us your stories, and do you care enough about this that you want to change this? Do you want to be part of this?
That's indeed what we said.
And it led to some amazing big meetings with cleaning, portering staff, catering staff, who said actually we're ignored often and we feel like a missing bit of the university. And I think it was...
We were listening not just for the stories, but we were listening for people that were cross enough, cared enough, had enough of it to get involved with the whole process. And we got one or two people to actually be involved as listeners as well. Yeah. So people who were not paid real living wage did the listening as well as being listened to. And they have subsequently been involved in other work to look at their jobs. And they said things like, there was a profound feeling of not being important and of not being listened to, not being noticed, which we started to address, and still needs a long way to go, but has come in a massive way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but I think because the university is an anchor institution within the region, it sends a message to other employers that this is a standard of good practice.
Yes.
Most of our organisations talk about poverty and inequality and how dreadful it is and we've got to do something about it. But the majority of them are paying poverty wages. And our challenge to them is, if you really care about this, you have to pay a real living wage. How can you pay staff at a level that they can't afford to live on?
Well, I've had
when
those
you're talking about
conversations.
poverty. Yeah. And I think the university's kind of set that marker that, we've got to do that.
But it's harder for the university to say that when we actually are quite we're a much more affluent organisation than some of these very small organisations who view themselves as entry level for people just getting their foot on. That's their argument to that, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of small organisations pay it, not able to. A lot of the voluntary sector organisations do. I think it's about putting that marker that you can employ more staff if you pay them all less. But is that really the model that you want to put out there? Because you're dumping your economic waste on our region. That we then have to deal with all the consequences of that. The food bank usage is one of them. So I think it does set a marker, and it does encourage others to follow. It's the first university in the northeast to pay the real living wage. We've got 4 others, and I really hope that we'll see all of those other 4 follow.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
And any university out there around the country as well.
So what next? What next for Tyne and Wear Citizens, and what next for the university? In terms of the university, because now we've got several years of being a founding partner and carrying on funding, that core funding, we've realised that staff have been involved more and more as well in actions, but we want to take that to a further step. So from next year, we're going to be funding some time from a community organiser based in the university. And we want to move that person in all the things I've already said, but also into widening participation, or that broad area of the university engaging in a wider student base than it normally does, especially in terms of the kind of traditional base of students from Newcastle University.
Yeah.
So I would say definitely read this book, and I want this book to be read by anybody with any kind of power, and people who don't necessarily think they do have power. So people in different organisations, I want them, people in policy making positions, people who work in charities, who work in local authorities, other kinds of businesses and organisations around the Northeast, in fact, in the whole country, in fact, the world. So it's very important to read this book. However, and I think people will get a whole range of different ideas, because it's not just our case study in this, and it's also got some framing for those case studies. But it's really important not just to read this book and do nothing. The whole point of this book is to take action. And we think our particular case study gives some really pretty interesting ways of taking action, but it isn't the only way. And I look forward to transformation as a result of this book.
Yeah, go forth.
That's what I want. Go forth and
change the
transform.
world.
Absolutely.